This morning is our next guest. We have, well, like I always say, in all due respect, we have one of those smart people, Henry, that's leaning into an issue that's impacting all of us, whether it be directly or indirectly because of someone we know, or just to the common good that we're all trying to improve and make better. And we have with us this morning University of Chicago clinical law professor Nicole Hallett. Good morning, Nicole, and welcome to Choose Views.
Good morning, Richard. It's nice to be on.
Thank you very much. Well, we had a little bit of a slow start this morning so the alarms were going off in the building, in the studio, so we had to have CPD and CFD come by and make sure that everything was good. But we're here and glad to have you on the show. And you are what I would say are one of those folks that is sleeves rolled up, elbows deep in the conversation around ICE and in the conversation around immigration rights. You direct a clinic that's part of the University of Chicago, if I'm correct. Is that right?
That's right. So I direct the Immigrants Rights Clinic, which is located at the law school at the University of Chicago.
So that's a big deal. And we right now have so many people they're obviously afraid, they're concerned, not for just themselves, but for those that they love and that they care about, whether they be of an immigrant community or not. They know someone that is impacted by the possibility of getting arrested. So take a little bit of time. And first of all, Nicole, tell our audience so that they have a better understanding of you about the clinic and about the work that you do at the clinic. And then we'll kind of pivot and talk about a very important concern that's out there right now. So let folks know a little bit about you and about what the clinic is actually doing.
Yeah, so the clinic represents non-citizens, immigrants, in a whole wide variety of ways. But one of the things we do is we try to represent people whom the government is trying to deport. And we also help people apply for humanitarian relief. We help people apply for asylum. We help domestic violence victims, victims of human trafficking, get lawful status so they can remain in the United States. And we also try to work with community organizations in Chicago to try to make sure that the rights of people in our immigrant communities are protected.
So this is a concern across the country, and you're here in Chicago with a background that's just extraordinary as a professor. But what are you, not so much how are you interacting and connecting with other folks that may be doing what you do or a version of that in other cities in the country? How are you guys kind of coming together in that space?
Well, I would say that I am working closely with other people in Chicago that are working on this issue. And we also have a national community of immigrants' rights advocates who are all really focused on this right now. As soon as the election happened, we knew that things were going to be changing, and we kind of sprang into action at that point. And I think one of our main goals, and this is in Chicago, it's also the case across the country, is that we want people to understand what their rights are, so that if they do have an encounter with ICE, they know what they can and they can't do, and they know how to protect themselves. So we've been really focusing on know your rights presentations to community groups, just so as many people as possible feel like they have the tools that they can have to try to protect themselves, and like you said, protect loved ones or other community members that they may know who aren't citizens.
So in terms of that protection and not knowing what to do, and many people, I think that's as much of the fear as anything is now, what do I do? What are my protocols? So I know it's a big question, but what are some of the things if a person, and I look at this in stages, Professor, if a person's detained, if they're formally arrested, or maybe even the lesser of the three, they're just, I guess you could say, softly detained. Someone of ICE or law enforcement comes up to them on the street and says, I'm being highly stereotypical here in saying this, but a law enforcement person sees 3 or 4 people that look in their mind suspicious. So what are some of the guidelines, some of the rules, some of the recommendations on any of those levels? You get stopped on the street, softly detained, someone comes into your place of work, majorly detained, or you get arrested.
Mm-hmm. Well, so the first thing I just want to emphasize, I think it's really important, is that just because you're an immigrant, or even if you are undocumented and you don't have lawful status in the United States, you still have constitutional rights. You are protected by the Constitution. So you have many of the same rights that all of us are probably aware of when we interact with law enforcement. So if someone comes up to you and starts asking questions, you're not required to respond. You can exercise your right to remain silent. They are not allowed to arrest you just because you look like an immigrant. They are not allowed to do that. That's racial profiling, and that will get them in trouble. So if someone were to come up to you and ask you, are you undocumented, and you think that they are, regardless of whether you know that they're ICE or not, I would say don't say anything. Ask if you're free to walk away and walk away. Now, if you're detained, obviously that's a different issue. You can't walk away if you're detained, but you still have the right to remain silent, and you should never sign anything that they put in front of you unless you've spoken to an attorney. You have the right to an attorney. Ask for an attorney. Oftentimes what happens is they try to get people to sign papers saying that they give up their right to challenge their deportation, and people don't even know what they're signing, and so they sign away their right to at least argue that they should be able to stay in the United States. So, walk away if you're not being detained, remain silent even if you are, and ask for an attorney. Those are the 3 most important things everyone needs to know.
Got it. And when someone is encountered or questioned, or to whatever the extent that may be, and the law enforcement individual crosses that line, what's the what are the rights of, what are the abilities of those who are put in that circumstances? What can they then exercise?
You mean if they're, arrested, even if you don't say anything, for instance?
Correct.
Like they step over a line and do something wrong?
I'm picturing that happening, on a particular street anywhere in America, and then that happens. So now what?
Well, I think there's 2 answers. The first is a practical one, which is most of the time nothing happens to them, and unfortunately the person ends up in the deportation system. But if you can get a lawyer, there are things you can do to challenge that. Just like in the criminal context, if the police search your car and they don't have probable cause, you can have the case thrown out in criminal court, or you can have the evidence that they obtain, thrown out of court so they can't use it against you. And there's a similar process in immigration court too. I think the main problem is that, unlike in the criminal context, although you have a right to an attorney, you don't have the right to have the government pay for an attorney for you. And so if you can't afford an attorney and you can't find a pro bono attorney, then it's really hard to fight your deportation, because it's a very complicated system. And so many people go through the process without an attorney. It's one reason why the work that we do in the clinic is so important. We don't charge our clients anything, and we take on cases pro bono for people who aren't able to afford an attorney. But we're just one little clinic, and there are, of course, thousands and hundreds of thousands of people that the government is targeting right now. And so that's one of the main challenges we're facing, is that, like you said at the beginning, there's a whole community of people that have come together to try to support immigrants, but there are just simply not enough of us to make sure that everybody gets legal representation if they need it.
Yeah, and that's you answered the thing that was running through my mind, and I'm sure through our listeners' minds all over the country, which is, so what happens if, and then how does someone then afford to have the support and the legal support that they need once that officer of any stature crosses the line, if you will, or puts them in a situation where now, they need legal support, legal advice. So that's what I wanted. I'm glad you were able to drill down on that. Dollars that are out there. I mean, what dollars are out there for folks to be able to have the representation that they will need in any of the circumstances? Are there dollars that are out there? Are there funds that are out there? Are there ways that American citizens can contribute to support those efforts?
There definitely are. There are many organizations that people can donate to who are providing that representation. And then the other thing that I would say is there are, in each area of the country, there are different ones, but there are bond funds where you can basically donate so that someone might be able to get out of detention if they get into detention. Unlike in the criminal context, you can't get an immigration bond, essentially. So, usually you only have to pay 10% and you're released, and you only have to pay the full amount if you don't show up to court. And that's not an option in immigration court, and so people have to pay the full amount. And many times people end up in detention, and they aren't really able to fight their case because they are detained. And so there are bond funds that people can donate to as well. But I would say that during the first Trump administration, there was a huge increase in donations for immigration work. And that kind of dropped off during the Biden administration, even though, the Biden administration was continuing to deport people. It wasn't like that stopped. And so we'll see. I'm hopeful that people will see that this is a really important issue. And when they go to decide how they're going to, distribute their charitable giving, that they'll consider donating to this cause, because, even just a small amount of money makes a huge difference. And, there are lots of us doing the work, and we would love to be able to hire more people to work with us to do the work. But for that, of course, we need funds. And most of these organizations are nonprofits where it's tax deductible. So, it would be like, if you donated to the food pantry, except you might this year direct some of those funds to supporting immigration work.
Yeah, and before we wrap up, we'll circle back to talk about how people can do that and where they can go. But you mentioned something regarding the previous 34-time convicted felons term, and now this current one. That's my little moniker that I've given them. I call them 34X CF, 34 times convicted felon. I try to, as little as possible, Professor, refer to him as President Trump, even Donald Trump. But that being said, enough about me. Are there any efforts that you've noticed or are aware of that he and or his administration are trying to defang the work that folks like you are doing? In other words, I just read earlier that is what's been some 75 executive orders. No legislation, ironically, passed by Congress, but 75 executive orders to just take stuff away from folks. Is there anything that you notice or are aware of that they're trying to throw at you guys in terms of, just, this is going to sound stupid, but that's the only way I can put it. You all can't do that. You can't be the legal representation for people who we think are illegal. Do you see where I'm going?
Yeah. No, I think you're right. The difference that I've seen between the first administration and this administration is that they are not shy about threatening to retaliate against people who are not supporting their agenda. Just recently, Tom Homan, who's one of the president's advisors on immigration, came to Chicago and complained that there were so many lawyers in Chicago who were telling people their rights, that they were preventing ICE from doing their job. And he said that it was obstruction of justice. And that's a term that kind of raised my eyebrows, because that's a crime, right? Mm-hmm. And there have been other statements that some of his advisors have made that just supporting the immigrant community, even just like, I don't know, providing food or shelter to people who might be homeless, that sort of thing, that the administration is planning on criminalizing that, so that any contact at all with anyone who's undocumented could open you up to criminal liability. And it is certainly something that people in the advocacy community are thinking about. You know, I've gone on, you know, radio shows and done newspaper interviews. You know, so my name is in the paper, and it's something that I have to consider, that at some point they may decide to try to go after people who are very visible and who are advocating on this issue. They haven't really done it yet, but they're claiming they will. And based on the first month of their administration, I'm very confident that we will get there eventually. So it is a very scary time, you know, to think that we would be penalized or punished or prosecuted because we're telling people about their constitutional rights is, you know, it's a new era that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to ask you the question. The genesis of that question was I'm telling anybody and everybody that I know, and I've been saying this on a private level, but I'll say it since we're on the air, that, you know, the concern, and I asked this question of someone that's maybe somewhat of a colleague of yours, and I don't want to make the assumption that because you guys do a similar thing, you know each other, but her name is Kate Lincoln Goldfinch, and she's an immigration attorney down in Texas, and she's been on our show a couple times. And so I just wanted to make sure that, you know, the folks like you are safe as best possible for doing the work that's, you know, you're allowed to do by Constitution, both federal and state constitution, and that's to help people with their right to counsel. And, you know, so it was in my mind, and I wanted to know if there's anything that you've been, you know, seeing or hearing. And you're kind, Professor Hallett. You're very kind, because when you were listing that the label, the title of Tom Homan, I was thinking, no, he's a thug and a bully. He's not.
Well, yes. I mean, you know, the people that he has in charge of immigration are so extreme. I mean, it's just this is beyond just simple immigration enforcement. This is an ideological project, obviously, and I'll just say it. I think it's like a white nationalist ideological project. This is obviously race coded, and they are committed to their agenda. It's going to be a scary 4 years. I would say I don't want to discourage anyone from speaking out, because even though it might be slightly more risky now than it was before, it is even more important. We can't abandon our friends and our neighbors and our family members who are feeling extremely vulnerable right now. You know, those of us, you know, I'm a U.S. citizen. I'm so lucky to be a U.S. citizen. That's a privilege. And I, you know, just would urge anyone who has that same privilege to use that privilege to help people who right now are terrified. And they are so worried that we're going to abandon them. And it's really important that we don't.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up, and thank you so much, Professor Hallett, for being with us this morning. And you're a voice that we hope we can have on our show again, because I know you know this, but people need to be reminded of the things that you've talked about this morning. And the last thing that you just said in terms of do your best to not be afraid to speak up and not be afraid to stand in the void to help people who deserve this protection and this support. How can folks get involved? How can folks help follow you? I know that as a professor at a university, there's some guidelines that you have to follow. But in terms of the clinic, what can folks do? How can folks get involved?
Well, they can certainly get in touch. We're always looking for volunteers. We've been doing some, you know, legal clinics in the community, and we're always looking for volunteers. So if you're in Chicago, you know, please reach out. We would love to have you. And I would say that if you know, I'm very lucky. My salary is funded by the university, so I don't need to fundraise. But there are so many amazing organizations out there. I would just shout out one national organization that's located in Chicago, which is the National Immigrant Justice Center. They do individual representations. They do impact litigation. They are doing everything. And so if you're looking for an organization to support, that's the one I would recommend.
Absolutely. That's great. With us this morning, Professor Nicole Hallett, clinical law professor at the University of Chicago, knowing your rights if you've been arrested by ICE. So thank you, Professor Hallett, for being with us this morning. I would love and be honored to have you back again, because it's going to be a rocky 4 years, and it's voices like yours that people need to hear and need to know that are out there.
Well, Thank you so much for having me. I'd love to be back.
Absolutely. Have a great day. Stay safe today. And you know it's going to snow, so be careful when you're out and about, okay?
Thank you.
All right. Bye now.